The birthday candles flickered across 40 tiny flames, casting dancing shadows on faces I used to trust. Someone had strung white lights along the deck railing, the kind that make everything look softer than it really is. The lake beyond was glass smooth, reflecting the last golden hour of sunset like a postcard nobody asked for. I stood near the railing with a gift bag in my hand, something expensive and thoughtful that I'd spent 3 days picking out, watching my cousin Brandon hold court in the center of attention like he was born for it. The smell of grilled steaks mixed with citronella and expensive cologne. Everyone had dressed up for this, his 40th, his milestone, his moment. What nobody knew yet was that this party, this whole performance, was happening on my property, and in about 6 minutes, that little detail was going to ruin everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Brandon's laugh boomed across the deck. That familiar sound that always seemed too big for whatever room or space he occupied. His wife Amber clung to his arm, all white teeth and highlighted hair, her linen dress probably costing more than most people's mortgage payments. My Aunt Victoria was arranging dessert plates on the outdoor table I'd custom-built 3 summers ago, the one with the inlaid stone pattern that took me 2 weeks to get right. Uncle Greg stood by the grill, beer in hand, nodding along to some story Brandon was telling about a business deal or a golf game or whatever successful men talk about when they want everyone to know they're winning at life. My brother Kyle caught my eye from across the deck and shrugged, that universal sibling gesture that meant he was as uncomfortable as I was, but had no idea why yet. The whole scene looked perfect, felt perfect, would have been perfect if it wasn't built on a lie nobody had bothered to check. I'd driven up from Milwaukee that morning, like I did most weekends during the summer months, 2 hours north on Highway 41, windows down, coffee going cold in the cup holder, mentally preparing myself for another family gathering where I'd smile and nod and pretend everything was fine. The invitation had come 3 weeks ago, Amber's voice too bright on the phone, insisting I absolutely had to be there for Brandon's big day. They were planning something special at the lake house, she'd said. Really special. The family would be gathering, grandmother Diane was coming. It would mean so much to Brandon, and because I'm the kind of person who still shows up even when every instinct screams to stay home, I'd said yes. I'd bought the gift. I'd cleared my weekend. I'd made the drive. What I hadn't done was ask the one question that might have changed everything: who exactly gave you permission to throw a party here? The lake house had been mine for 8 years, 2 months and 17 days, but if you asked anyone in my family, they'd tell you it belonged to all of us. That's how it worked in the Walsh-Mitchell clan, where boundaries were suggestions and ownership was apparently negotiable. My parents bought the place back in 1998, a modest 2-bedroom cabin that needed work but had good bones, and a view that made you forget about traffic and deadlines and all the noise that filled up regular life. They'd spent summers here, winters too sometimes, talking about eventually retiring to this exact spot where the water met the sky, and nothing ever seemed urgent. But then my dad's heart gave out during a Tuesday morning meeting, and 6 months later my mom followed him, not from any disease the doctors could name, just from the kind of broken that doesn't show up on medical charts. I was 26, working a job I hated, living in an apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking, and suddenly I was inheriting a lake house and a life insurance payout and a grief so heavy it had its own gravitational pull. The family had opinions, of course. Aunt Victoria thought I should sell it, split the money, be practical. Brandon suggested turning it into a rental property, something that could generate income, build wealth, think about the future. Grandmother Diane had patted my hand and said whatever I decided would be fine, but family should stick together, and wouldn't it be nice if everyone could still enjoy the place my parents had loved so much? I'd listened to all of them, nodded through their advice, and then I'd done exactly what I wanted. I bought out any potential claims, hired a lawyer named Patricia Hoffman, who didn't smile much but knew property law like some people know prayer, and I transferred that deed into my name alone. Lauren Mitchell, sole owner, No exceptions, no shared titles, no room for interpretation. It cost me most of the insurance money. It took 4 months of paperwork, and it was the best decision I ever made, even though I didn't know it yet. The renovations started that first spring. I ripped out the old kitchen where my mother used to make blueberry pancakes on Sunday mornings, replaced it with something modern but warm, white subway tiles and butcher block counters and windows that let in so much light you could grow plants on the sill year-round. I rewired the electrical system, because the old one was a fire hazard waiting for an excuse. I replaced the roof after a bad storm left shingles scattered across the yard like playing cards. I built that dock, the one currently holding Brandon's friend's boat and somebody's jet ski, because the old one was rotting and unsafe, and I got tired of worrying about it every time I came up here. I installed the stone fireplace in the living room, hauling rocks up from the shoreline, and fitting them together like a puzzle only I could see. I carved the wooden sign that hung by the driveway, Mitchell's Landing, burning the letters in with a tool I'd bought specifically for that purpose. Every nail, every board, every fixture and finish, I either installed myself or paid someone else to do it right. This place wasn't just mine on paper, it was mine in sweat and splinters, and Saturday afternoons spent covered in paint and determination, but I'd made one critical mistake. I'd been too generous with access. Because it was a family place once, and because I didn't want to be the person who locked everyone out of memories, I'd left a key hidden under a fake rock by the back steps. I'd told people they could use it if they needed to get away, if they wanted a weekend on the water, just let me know first, just check the calendar, just make sure I'm not already here. Simple rules, easy boundaries, the kind of thing reasonable people follow without issue. Except Brandon wasn't reasonable. Brandon was entitled, and over the past 8 years, those simple requests had slowly dissolved into assumptions. He'd bring friends up without asking. He'd mention casually at family dinners that he'd spent the previous weekend at the lake house, like it was his to loan out. When grandmother Diane needed a place to recover after her hip surgery, Brandon had suggested she stay at the lake, volunteered my space without checking if I had plans. And every time I'd bitten my tongue, I'd told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Family was complicated. Pick your battles. Don't be difficult. All those things we tell ourselves when we're choosing peace over self-respect. The sun dipped lower, turning the lake into liquid copper. Someone turned on music, something classic rock and nostalgic, that made people sway with drinks in their hands. Aunt Victoria called everyone to gather. Time to sing. Time to celebrate, time to make this moment something Brandon would remember. I moved closer despite myself, still holding that gift bag with its tissue paper and card I'd written by hand, because Brandon always said he appreciated the personal touch. Amber started the song, and everyone joined in, voices overlapping and off-key but enthusiastic, the way families sing when they're lubricated by beer, and the belief that
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
they're closer than they actually are. Brandon grinned wide, playing humble but loving every second, and when the song ended he raised his glass high. "Thank you," he said, voice carrying across the deck. "Thank you all for being here, for making this so special, for gathering at this incredible place that means so much to our family." Our family, those 2 words landed like stones in my chest. I felt my jaw tighten, felt something cold and sharp starting to move through my veins. He kept talking, something about memories and tradition, and how lucky we were to have this space, this retreat, this sanctuary that had been in the family for so long. He talked about the updates that had been done over the years, improvements that made it even better, investments in the future. He didn't mention my name. He didn't acknowledge the hours or the money, or the decisions that had transformed this place from my parents' modest cabin into whatever it was now. He just kept talking like he was the narrator of a story I wasn't part of, and everyone kept nodding along, like his version of events was the only one that mattered. Then Uncle Greg stepped forward, clearing his throat in that way people do when they're about to say something they think is important. He put a hand on Brandon's shoulder, squeezed it with paternal pride, and looked around at all of us gathered there. In the golden light, we wanted to do something special for Brandon this year. He said, 40 is a big one, a milestone, a time to think about legacy and what we're building and what we're passing down. He paused for effect, letting the moment stretch. Aunt Victoria was smiling, that tight, pleased smile of someone who knows a secret nobody else does. And that's when I felt it, that specific dread that comes right before your life splits into before and after. Uncle Greg continued, voice warm and sure, we know how much Brandon loves this place, how much he's always considered it his second home, his refuge. So we talked to Grandmother Diane, and we all agreed, we want to make it official. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folder, cream-colored and expensive-looking. Inside, he said, was a deed transfer, papers drawn up by their family lawyer, documents that would officially put the lake house in Brandon's name, a gift from the family to recognize everything he'd meant to all of us, everything he'd contributed, all the times he'd opened this place up for gatherings, just like this one, a collective inheritance, Greg called it. Something that should have happened years ago. The deck went quiet, except for the music still playing from someone's portable speaker. Time felt slow and fast simultaneously, like watching a car accident from inside the vehicle. Brandon's face went through several expressions at once, surprise and joy, and something that looked almost like relief, like he'd been waiting for this moment and finally it had arrived. Amber actually squealed, pressed her hands to her mouth in delight. Other family members started clapping, raising glasses, calling out congratulations. My brother Kyle looked confused, glancing at me with questions in his eyes, and Grandmother Diane sat in her chair near the door, nodding slowly, her face unreadable, but her silence saying everything. I should have felt shock, I should have felt anger or betrayal, or hurt, or any of the appropriate emotions for watching your family try to steal your property while calling it a gift. But what I actually felt was something much colder, much clearer. I felt the kind of calm that comes right before you burn something down, because in that moment, watching Brandon accept congratulations for inheriting a house I owned, watching my aunt and uncle smile, like they'd done something generous instead of something legally impossible, watching an entire gathering of people celebrate theft disguised as tradition, I realized I'd been far too kind for far too long. I'd let assumptions grow into expectations. I'd let boundary violations become normal. I'd chosen silence over confrontation so many times that these people actually believed their own fiction. Brandon held the folder up like a trophy, and someone shouted speech. Others joined in, clapping rhythmically, wanting him to say something meaningful. He laughed, playing modest, but you could see he was already composing something in his head. Before he could start though, before he could deliver whatever heartfelt nonsense he was preparing, I stepped forward. Not rushed, not aggressive, just a simple step that put me closer to the center of attention. The movement was enough to make a few people glance my way. Brandon noticed, paused, gave me that big cousin smile that had probably charmed teachers and employers his whole life. Lauren, he said warmly, I'm so glad you could make it. This place wouldn't be the same without you here. He said it like I was a guest, like my presence was a favor I'd granted rather than a right I owned. And that's when I felt it fully, that absolute certainty that comes right before you change everything. I smiled back at him, a real smile, the kind that probably looked friendly to anyone who didn't know better. I'm glad I could make it too, I said, my voice steady and clear. I wouldn't have missed this for anything, because I think there might be some confusion we need to clear up before anyone opens that folder. I watched confusion ripple across Brandon's face, like I'd just spoken a language he didn't understand. The folder in his hand suddenly looked less like a trophy, and more like evidence of something he hadn't thought through. Aunt Victoria's smile flickered at the edges, uncertain now, while Uncle Greg's expression shifted from proud patriarch to something harder to read. The music kept playing in the background, some classic rock anthem about taking it easy, which felt absurdly inappropriate for what was about to happen. I kept my stance relaxed, my tone conversational, because the beautiful thing about having absolute certainty on your side is that you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. Confusion, Brandon repeated, his laugh just a fraction too loud. What kind of confusion? Lauren, we're just trying to do something nice here, something meaningful for the family. His hand gestured broadly at the lake house behind us, the deck we stood on, the view that had probably doubled in value since I'd bought the place. This has always been about family, he continued. About keeping something special alive for all of us to enjoy. His tone had shifted slightly, taking on that patient quality people use when they think you're being unreasonable, but they're willing to humor you anyway. I could see Amber watching me now, her earlier delight replaced with something more cautious, like she was recalculating social equations in real time. I nodded slowly, still smiling, still calm. You're absolutely right that this place is special. I said, my parents loved it here. They invested years of their lives and a lot of their resources into making it a home. I paused, letting that sink in for just a moment, and when they passed away, I made sure to honor that investment by taking care of it properly. The problem is, Brandon, you can't transfer a deed for property you don't own, and none of you own this lake house. I do. I've owned it for 8 years. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture, thick and heavy enough to feel against your skin. Someone finally had the presence of mind to turn off the music, and suddenly all you could hear was the gentle lap of water against the dock and the distant call of a loon somewhere across Cedar Point Lake. Brandon's mouth opened slightly, closed again, opened once more like he was trying to form words, but his brain couldn't quite figure out which ones to use. Uncle Greg's face went from tan to slightly gray, the color of someone who just realized they'd miscalculated something important. Aunt Victoria actually laughed, a short sharp sound that had no humor in it, more reflex than response. That's not possible, Victoria said, stepping forward now, her voice taking on that authoritative tone she'd perfected over years of running school fundraisers and homeowner association meetings. This property has been in the family for decades. When your parents died, it became part of the estate. We all have claim to it. She said it with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that I almost admired her commitment to a reality that existed only in her imagination. Several other family members were nodding along, wanting to believe her version because it was easier, because it meant the world still made sense the way they'd understood it. I reached into my bag, the same one that held Brandon's birthday gift, and pulled out something I'd brought as insurance, not quite believing I'd actually need it but prepared nonetheless. It was a folder thinner than the one Uncle Greg had produced, but infinitely more powerful. I held it loosely at my side, not yet offering it for inspection. Actually, Victoria, the property became part of the estate briefly, which is why I had to buy it properly, I said. My voice stayed even, almost gentle, the way you might explain something complicated to a child who was struggling with new math. I hired a lawyer 8 years ago, Patricia Hoffman out of Madison, and we made sure everything was done correctly. I bought out any potential claims from the estate. I paid fair market value. I transferred the deed entirely into my name. Lauren Mitchell, sole owner, no exceptions. Brandon finally found his voice, though it came out higher than his usual confident baritone. You never told us that, he said, and there was accusation in it, like I'd committed some crime by not broadcasting my financial decisions to people who had no legal right to know about them. You let us think it still belonged to everyone. You let us use it, come up here whenever we wanted. Why would you do that if you were going to pull something like this? Something like this, I repeated, tasting those words. You mean something like not letting you steal my property? I wasn't pulling anything, Brandon. I was being generous. I gave you access because this place meant something to Mom and Dad, and I thought family should still be able to enjoy it. But I said to let me know before you came up. I said to check the calendar. I said there were basic rules about respect and communication. I never said you owned it. I never implied you could make decisions about it. And I certainly never gave anyone permission to forge transfer documents and throw a party to celebrate taking something that was never yours to give away. The word forge hung in the air like smoke. Uncle Greg's hand tightened around his beer bottle, knuckles going white. "That's a serious accusation," he said, his voice dropping to something darker. "We had papers drawn up by a legitimate attorney. This was a family decision, approved by grandmother Diane, meant to honor Brandon and recognize his connection to this place. There's nothing forged about it." But even as he said it, I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression, like maybe he was starting to realize that having papers drawn up and having legal authority to sign those papers were two very different things. I opened my folder then, slowly, deliberately. Inside were copies, because I'd learned early in life that you never hand over original documents to people who've already proven they don't respect boundaries. The first page was the deed, recorded with the county, showing my name and the date of transfer from 8 years ago. Below that were receipts, a thick stack of them, every major renovation and repair I'd paid for over the years. The new roof, $14,000. The kitchen remodel, $22,000. The dock replacement, $8,000. The electrical rewiring, $6,000. Page after page of proof that I hadn't just owned this property on paper, I'd invested in it, maintained it, improved it with my own money and my own labor. I walked over to where Uncle Greg stood and held out the folder, not aggressively but with the calm confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're holding. "You can look through this if you want," I said, "or you can call Patricia Hoffman yourself, her number's on the card clipped to the front. She'll confirm everything I just told you. She'll also probably tell you that attempting to transfer property you don't own is more than just awkward, it's potentially illegal depending on how you framed the documents and what you told your attorney." Greg took the folder like it might bite him, flipping through the first few pages with an expression that shifted from defensive to increasingly concerned. Victoria leaned over his shoulder, her face going through its own journey of realization. I could see the exact moment it hit her, when her eyes landed on that official deed with its county stamp, and my name in clear black letters. Her mouth pressed into a thin line, color rising in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't quite tell, probably both. Brandon still stood frozen near the birthday cake, that folder of fake documents hanging loose in his hand, like he'd forgotten he was holding it. His wife Amber had moved closer to him, one hand on his arm, her expression cycling between confusion and something that looked like dawning horror. I wondered what they'd been told, what narrative had been sold to them, to make this seem reasonable. Had they been told I'd agreed to this? Had they been told the property was jointly owned, and this was just paperwork catching up to reality? Or had they known exactly what this was, and simply not cared, because they wanted what they wanted? "This is insane," Brandon finally said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Even if you do own it, even if the paperwork is in your name, this place has been family property in spirit. We've all used it. We've all made memories here. You can't just decide one day that none of that matters." He was grasping now, trying to find some moral high ground in a situation where he had none. "We're family, Lauren. Family doesn't do this to each other." I turned to face him fully, and I let some of the warmth drain from my expression. "You're absolutely right, that family doesn't do this to each other," I said quietly. "Family doesn't throw a party on someone else's property without permission. Family doesn't try to transfer a deed to a house they don't own. Family doesn't stand up in front of everyone and accept congratulations for stealing something while pretending it's a gift. So, which one of us isn't acting like family here, Brandon? Because from where I'm standing, I'm the only person on this deck who actually respects property rights and basic honesty." My brother Kyle had moved closer during this exchange, and he was looking at me with something between admiration and concern. I could tell he was processing the information in real time, rewinding through years of assumptions and casual mentions of the lake house, to understand how we'd all gotten here. He'd always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found compromises, but even he seemed to recognize that this was beyond his usual diplomatic skills. Grandmother Diane spoke then, her voice thin but clear from her chair, near the doorway. She was 83, and sharper than most people half her age, though she'd learned to use her age as a shield when convenient. "Lauren dear, I think perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," she said, employing that gentle grandmother tone that usually worked to diffuse tension. "We only wanted to make sure the property stayed in the family. We were worried about what might happen if you decided to sell it, or if something happened to you. This was meant to be protective, not harmful." I walked over to her chair and knelt down so we were at eye level, my voice soft enough that only the people nearest could hear clearly. "Grandmother, I love you, but let's not pretend this was about protection," I said. "If you were worried about the property's future, you could have asked me about my plans. You could have suggested I add someone to the deed, or set up a trust, or any number of legal options that actually involve talking to the person who owns it. Instead, you conspired with Victoria and Greg to create fake documents and throw a surprise party designed to pressure me into going along with something I was never asked about. That's not protection, that's manipulation, and I'm honestly disappointed that you were part of it." Her face hardened then, the gentle grandmother mask slipping to reveal something more calculating underneath. "You always were too independent for your own good," she said, loud enough now for others to hear. "Your mother worried about that. She worried you'd end up alone, because you couldn't learn to compromise, couldn't learn to put family first. Is this what she would have wanted? For you to throw everything in our faces over paperwork?" The mention of my mother hit exactly where Grandmother Diane intended, that specific spot where grief and guilt live together in complicated tangles. But I'd had 8 years to work through that grief, 8 years to understand that my mother's kindness had sometimes been confused with weakness by people who took advantage of it. I stood back up, my legs steady, my voice steadier. "My mother would have wanted me to stand up for myself," I said. "She would have wanted me to build something of my own, and protect it. And she definitely would not have wanted her family to lie to her daughter and steal her property while calling it tradition. So please don't use her memory to justify something she would have found horrifying." Uncle Greg had finished looking through my folder and handed it back with an expression that was hard to read. "Fine," he said, the word coming out clipped. "You own the property. Legally, officially, whatever. But you're really going to stand here on your cousin's birthday and humiliate him in front of everyone over this? You're going to ruin this whole celebration, because you can't let us honor him with something meaningful." There was desperation under his anger now, the recognition that this celebration he'd planned was collapsing in real time, and he had no way to stop it. "I'm not ruining anything," I said calmly. "You ruined it when you decided to forge property documents instead of having an honest conversation. I didn't show up here planning to make a scene. I brought a gift. I was going to sing happy birthday, and eat cake and pretend everything was fine, just like I always do. But then you stood up there and announced you were stealing my house, and apparently I'm supposed to just smile and let it happen so nobody feels uncomfortable." I shook my head. "No, I'm done pretending. I'm done making myself smaller so everyone else can feel bigger." Brandon finally seemed to fully absorb what was happening, the reality that this party, this moment, this gift he'd already accepted in his mind, was never going to materialize the way he'd imagined. His face had gone red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell, maybe both. "So what now?" he demanded. "You kick us all out? You call the cops? You sue us? What's your endgame here, Lauren? Because congratulations, you've made your point. You own the house. We get it. But you're destroying the family in the process." I looked around at the assembled faces, at aunts and uncles and cousins and family friends, who'd come here expecting a party and gotten something else entirely. Some looked angry, others confused, a few sympathetic though they weren't sure who they should sympathize with yet. The fairy lights still twinkled, the lake still glowed with sunset. The birthday cake still waited with its 40 candles, slowly melting into the frosting. Everything looked perfect, except for the fundamental rot underneath it all, the assumption that my property and my boundaries were negotiable whenever they became inconvenient for someone else. Here's my endgame, I said, my voice carrying across the deck. Everyone here is welcome to stay and finish the party. Vood, have the cake. Celebrate Brandon's birthday. But when it's over, when everyone leaves, this stops being treated like community property. No more just showing up. No more assuming access. No more making plans for my space without asking me first. And that folder of fake documents? I'd suggest you tear it up and forget it ever existed, because if anyone tries to file it or use it in any legal capacity, I will press charges. Not because I'm vindictive, but because I'm done being taken advantage of by people who are supposed to care about me. The thing is, I continued, letting my gaze sweep across all of them. I've been generous for 8 years. I've shared this place even when it cost me weekends and money and peace of mind. I've let things slide that I should have addressed because I didn't want to be difficult. But generosity only works when it's respected. And you've made it clear you don't respect me or my ownership or my right to make decisions about my own property. So yes, things are going to change. Not because I want to destroy the family, but because I finally understand that protecting myself isn't the same thing as attacking you, no matter how much you want to frame it that way. Amber spoke up then, her voice tight with something between anger and tears. This is unbelievable, she said. All of this over a house, over paperwork and deeds and legal nonsense. Brandon loves this place. He's taken care of it, brought his friends here, made it a gathering spot for everyone, and you're really going to take that away from him on his birthday because you're obsessed with ownership. I turned to her, and I made sure my expression was clear and direct. Amber, I said, Brandon has never taken care of this place. I have. He's never paid for repairs or maintenance or property taxes or insurance. I have. He's never coordinated with the county about permits or dealt with frozen pipes in winter or replaced broken appliances. I have. What Brandon has done is use something I paid for and maintained while taking credit for its existence. And that's fine. That was the arrangement, even if it was unspoken. But when that arrangement turns into him trying to take ownership of something he has no legal or moral claim to, then yes, I'm going to take that away. Not because I'm obsessed with ownership, but because I understand the difference between sharing and being robbed. Victoria had been quiet for several minutes, looking through the documents in my folder one more time, like she might find something that would change the equation. Finally, she closed it and handed it back. Her face composed, but her voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. You've made yourself very clear, she said. And I'm sure you feel very justified right now, very righteous, but I hope you understand what you're doing to this family. I hope you understand that after tonight, things will never be the same. People will remember this. They'll remember that when it came down to it, you chose a house over your cousin, property over people, legal rights over family bonds. I took the folder back and tucked it carefully into my bag. You're absolutely right that things will never be the same, I said. But not because I chose property over people, because you tried to steal from me and got caught, because you thought you could pressure me into giving up something I built through manipulation and public celebration, and because instead of apologizing when you got called out, you're standing here trying to make me feel guilty for refusing to be stolen from. So yes, people will remember this night. They'll remember that the family tried to take something that wasn't theirs, and when they couldn't, they blamed the victim for not going along with the theft. Uncle Greg made a sound of frustration, running his hand through his hair. This is pointless, he said. She's not going to listen to reason. She's made up her mind to be difficult about this, and nothing we say is going to change that. He turned to the other guests, many of whom had been standing frozen throughout this entire exchange, unsure whether to stay or leave or intervene. I think we should probably wrap this up, he announced. Obviously, the celebration isn't going to continue the way we planned, but I wasn't quite done yet because there was one more thing that needed to be said, one more piece that needed to be put in place. Actually, I said, raising my voice just enough to make sure everyone could hear, there's something else you should all know. I pulled out my phone and opened up a specific folder, one I'd created several months ago but never expected to actually use. I started noticing things about a year ago. I said, garbage in the cans when I hadn't been up here, different furniture arrangements, food in the refrigerator I didn't buy. Small things, easy to dismiss individually, but they added up. So I installed a security system. Nothing invasive, just a camera by the front door and one on the dock, motion activated, uploading to the cloud. I could see comprehension dawning on several faces, particularly Brandon's, as they began to understand where this was going. Over the past year, I continued, that system has recorded 47 separate instances of people entering this property when I wasn't here and hadn't given permission. Brandon, you're in about 30 of those videos, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, twice with people I've never even met who you apparently gave keys to. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. I have footage of you telling your buddy Mike that you basically owned the place and I just handled the paperwork. I have footage of a party last 4th of July that I definitely didn't know about, complete with people I've never met swimming off my dock and using my fire pit. Why? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Would you have cameras if you trusted us? I didn't answer her directly, just continued laying out the facts. I also have recordings, I said, from a system I had installed in March, audio only again, motion activated, in the common areas, nothing in bathrooms or bedrooms, nothing that would violate anyone's reasonable privacy, but I have recordings of conversations that happened in this house when you thought no one was listening. I looked at Uncle Greg specifically, including one from 2 months ago where you and Victoria discussed the whole deed transfer plan, how you'd present it as a family decision, how you'd time it for Brandon's birthday, so I'd be less likely to make a scene. You called it making sure the property stayed where it belonged. You laughed about how I'd probably just go along with it, because I always do. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, heavier with implications. This wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. This was about premeditation, about planning and conspiracy, about people who'd knowingly plotted to take something that wasn't theirs while maintaining smiles and family dinners and birthday wishes. Greg's face had gone from gray to almost purple, his jaw working like he was trying to find words that wouldn't incriminate him further. Victoria looked like she might actually be sick, one hand pressed to her stomach. You recorded us, Greg finally managed, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, like he'd found the moral high ground he'd been searching for. You put secret cameras and microphones in a family property and spied on your own relatives. That's illegal. That's a violation of privacy. That's probably worse than anything you're accusing us of. I shook my head slowly. Actually, Uncle Greg, Wisconsin is a one-party consent state for recordings, and since I'm the property owner, I can record whatever happens on my property without anyone else's permission. I checked with Patricia before I installed anything. She said as long as I wasn't recording in areas where people had a reasonable expectation of privacy, like bathrooms or bedrooms, I was completely within my rights. So no, it's not illegal. It's just smart. It's what you do when you suspect people are taking advantage of you, but you need proof before you can act on it. Brandon found his voice again, though it came out strained. So what, you're going to use those recordings against us? You're going to blackmail your own family? His attempt at outrage would have been more effective if his hands weren't shaking slightly, if his earlier confidence hadn't completely evaporated. What do you want, Lauren? Money? An apology? What's it going to take for you to just let this go? And that, finally, was the question I'd been waiting for someone to ask. I want exactly what I said earlier, I replied. I want this to stop being treated like community property. I want respect for the fact that I own it and I get to make decisions about it. I want people to ask before they come up here instead of just showing up. And honestly, I want some acknowledgement that what you tried to do tonight was wrong. Not illegal necessarily, though your lawyer might disagree once they understand you were trying to transfer property you had no authority over, but definitely wrong. Definitely a betrayal, definitely something that should never have happened. Grandmother Diane stood up from her chair with effort, waving away the hand that Kyle extended to help her. She moved slowly across the deck, until she was standing directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell her familiar perfume, the same scent she'd worn for as long as I could remember. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, searched my face like she was looking for something she'd lost, some version of me that would be easier to manage. "You've changed," she said finally, and it wasn't a compliment. "There was a time when you understood what family meant, when you knew that some things mattered more than being right. Your mother would bend, would compromise, would find ways to make everyone happy even when it cost her something. She understood that keeping the peace was more important than keeping score. But you," she shook her head slowly, "you've become hard, inflexible, so focused on what you're owed that you can't see what you're destroying." I held her gaze without flinching, though something in my chest tightened at the comparison to my mother. It was a move Grandmother Diane had used before, weaponizing my mom's memory whenever she wanted to manipulate one of us into compliance. "My mother bent until she broke," I said quietly. "She compromised until there was nothing left of what she wanted or needed. She made everyone else happy while swallowing her own disappointments and pretending everything was fine. And you know what that got her? A heart that gave up 6 months after Dad died, because she'd spent so much of her life taking care of everyone else that she forgot to take care of herself. So forgive me if I'm not interested in following that particular example." Diane's hand came up fast, and for a second I thought she might actually slap me, something she'd never done even when we were children testing boundaries. But her hand stopped inches from my face, trembling slightly, before she lowered it back to her side. "How dare you," she whispered, her voice shaking with anger or age or both. "How dare you speak about your mother that way, twist her kindness into weakness, turn her generosity into some kind of cautionary tale. She loved this family. She would never have stood here and accused us of theft, of conspiracy, of whatever legal terms you want to throw around to make yourself feel superior." I took a breath, steadying myself, because this was the moment where I either backed down like I always had before, or I pushed through into territory we couldn't come back from. "Mom did love this family," I agreed, "but that doesn't mean the family loved her back the same way. I remember things, Grandmother. I remember Dad's 50th birthday, when Mom had planned a small dinner and you insisted on inviting 40 people, then got upset when she looked stressed instead of grateful. I remember when she wanted to take that pottery class and you told her it was selfish to spend money on hobbies when family needed things. I remember every time she tried to do something for herself and someone made her feel guilty about it until she gave in and did what everyone else wanted instead." My voice was steady, but I could feel emotion building behind it, years of observations I'd kept quiet about because pointing out family dysfunction was considered rude, disloyal, a betrayal of the very people who were betraying you. "She loved you all so much that she forgot to love herself," I continued, "and I watched that happen. I watched her get smaller and quieter and more invisible until she was just a person who made sure everyone else was comfortable while she disappeared. So no, I'm not going to apologize for being hard or inflexible, or whatever you want to call it, when someone finally draws a line and refuses to let people cross it." Kyle had moved closer during this exchange, positioning himself slightly between me and Grandmother Diane, like he might need to physically intervene. His face showed the strain of someone trying to process too many revelations at once, rearranging his understanding of family history through a lens he'd never considered before. "Lauren," he said softly, and I could hear the plea in his voice, the desperate hope that maybe we could all still walk this back somehow. Maybe we should all take a breath here, maybe this conversation needs to happen, but not right now, not like this, not in front of everyone. But I shook my head, Because I'd spent too many years having important conversations in private where they could be dismissed, or rewritten, or forgotten, as soon as they became inconvenient. No, I said, this needs to happen exactly like this, in front of everyone who was supposed to witness me losing my property tonight, everyone who was going to smile and clap while Brandon accepted a deed to my house. They should see what happens when that plan falls apart. They should understand that silence doesn't mean agreement, and that some of us are done pretending. Brandon had sunk into one of the deck chairs, his birthday celebration thoroughly ruined, his face showing the kind of shock that comes from having your entire understanding of a situation dismantled in real time. He looked younger suddenly, less like the successful businessman who commanded rooms, and more like someone who'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong, but thought he'd never have to answer for. This is insane, he said again, but the fight had gone out of his voice. All of this, everything you're saying, the cameras and recordings and accusations, it's just too much. Over what? Over us thinking we had more access than we actually did. Over a misunderstanding about ownership. It's not a misunderstanding when you have documents drawn up to transfer property, I said. That's not confusion, Brandon, that's intentional. That's you and Uncle Greg, and Aunt Victoria, and whoever else was involved sitting down with a lawyer, and having papers created to give you something that was mine. That requires planning, that requires conscious choice. That requires looking at my property, and deciding you wanted it, and then figuring out how to take it without asking me first. Amber had her arm around Brandon's shoulders now, and she was looking at me with unconcealed hostility. So what happens now? She asked. You've humiliated him in front of everyone, exposed all these recordings, made your point about ownership 1,000 times over. What's the endgame? Are you pressing charges, getting restraining orders, burning down every relationship you have because of property lines? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I considered it carefully before answering. I wasn't interested in charges or restraining orders unless someone forced my hand by trying to follow through with the fake deed transfer. What I wanted was simpler and somehow more complicated than legal action. I want acknowledgement, I said finally. I want someone in this family to look at what happened tonight and admit it was wrong. Not just wrong because you got caught, but wrong because you tried it in the first place. I want someone to understand that you can't just take what you want from people and call it family tradition. The lake had gone dark while we'd been talking, the sunset fading into deep purple twilight. Someone had turned on the deck lights at some point, harsh and bright after the soft glow of evening. The birthday cake sat forgotten on the table, candles long since burned down to nothing, wax pooling on the frosting that nobody was going to eat now. The party that was supposed to be a celebration had become something else entirely, a reckoning that nobody had wanted but everyone had needed. Uncle Greg made a sound of disgust, throwing up his hands in frustration. Fine, he said, you want an admission, here it is. We shouldn't have done this without talking to you first. We should have had a conversation about the future of the property instead of making assumptions. Is that what you want to hear? Does that make you feel better? He said it with such obvious resentment that the words themselves meant nothing, just sounds he was making to try to end a situation he couldn't control. That's not an acknowledgement, I said calmly. That's you saying whatever you think will make me go away. An acknowledgement would sound like understanding that you tried to steal from me, that you betrayed my trust, that you involved my grandmother and my cousin in something that was fundamentally dishonest, and hoped I'd be too polite or too afraid of family conflict to stop it. An acknowledgement would include some recognition that I have every right to be angry and hurt and unwilling to just let this slide, because it's uncomfortable for everyone. Victoria had been standing near the railing, staring out at the dark water, like she might find answers there. When she finally turned back to face me, her expression was complicated, showing layers of emotion I couldn't quite parse. You're right, she said, and the admission seemed to surprise even her. The words came out rough, unpracticed, like she wasn't used to saying them. We did this wrong. We made assumptions we shouldn't have made.
Hey.
We involved Brandon in something we should have discussed with you first, and yes, we hoped you'd go along with it rather than make waves. We thought you'd understand it was about keeping the property in the family, not about hurting you. It was more than I'd expected from her, though it still fell short of actual accountability, but before I could respond, she continued, her voice hardening slightly, but you need to understand something too, Lauren. When you bought this place, and kept it entirely in your name, you sent a message, you told the family that this wasn't shared anymore, that it was yours alone, that our history here, and our memories here, didn't count for anything against your legal ownership. You drew a line first, even if you thought you were being generous by letting us visit, so maybe we read that situation wrong, but you created the situation in the first place. The argument was familiar, the kind of twisted logic that takes someone protecting their own property and turns it into an act of aggression. I drew a line by legally purchasing something I had every right to purchase. I created a situation by using my inheritance to buy a house and put it in my name. That's not drawing a line, Victoria, that's existing as an independent adult who makes financial decisions. The fact that you interpret basic property ownership as some kind of attack on the family says more about your expectations than it does about my behavior. But she wasn't finished, and I could see her gaining confidence as she found a narrative that made sense to her, that turned this whole situation into something where she wasn't entirely at fault. You could have involved us in the decision, she insisted. You could have made it a family trust, or added names to the deed, or found some way to honor the fact that this place meant something to all of us, not just you. Instead, you shut everyone out, kept all the control, and then acted surprised when people who'd been coming here for decades still thought of it as family property. I felt Kyle tense beside me, clearly uncomfortable with how Victoria was trying to shift blame back onto me. But I put a hand on his arm, a gentle signal that I could handle this, that I didn't need him to fight this particular battle. The problem with your logic, I said to Victoria, is that you're equating emotional attachment with ownership rights. Yes, people have memories here, yes, this place meant something to the family historically, but none of that gives anyone else claim to property I purchased with my own money. If Dad had left you his car in his will, and you sold it and bought a different car, would the family expect partial ownership of your new car because they had memories of the old one? Would we try to forge title transfers because we felt emotionally connected to your vehicle? The analogy was absurd enough that several people shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the flawed logic, even if they didn't want to admit it. But Victoria's face flushed with anger. A house isn't a car, she shot back. A lake house, that's been used for family gatherings for decades, isn't the same as a personal vehicle. You're deliberately misunderstanding the situation to make us look unreasonable. I'm not making you look unreasonable, I replied. I'm pointing out that you are being unreasonable. You're arguing that because you have emotional attachment to something I own, you should have partial ownership of it without contributing financially to its purchase, maintenance, or improvement. That's not how property works. That's not how anything works. And the fact that you're trying to turn this into me being selfish for not giving away what's mine shows exactly why I was right to keep full ownership in the first place. Grandmother Diane had sat back down in her chair, looking suddenly exhausted in a way that made her age more visible. All of this arguing, she said quietly, all of this back and forth about who's right and who's wrong, it doesn't change anything. The family is fractured now. Whatever we were before tonight, we're not anymore, and maybe that's what you wanted, Lauren. Maybe you needed to blow everything up to feel powerful, but I hope it was worth it. I hope the house, and the deed, and being legally correct keep you warm when you're sitting up here alone, with nobody to share it with. The words were designed to wound, to make me question whether standing up for myself was worth the cost of family relationships. It was manipulation, wearing the costume of wisdom, a final attempt to make me feel guilty for refusing to be victimized quietly. I looked at her for a long moment before responding, and when I did, my voice was softer than it had been, but no less firm. Grandmother, I said, I've been alone in this house plenty of times over the past 8 years. I've spent weekends up here by myself, doing repairs and maintenance, and watching the sunset from this deck with nobody to share it with. And you know what? I was fine, I was peaceful, I was content, because being alone is different from being lonely, and being lonely is different from being used. I moved closer to her chair, crouching down again, so we were eye level. What I won't be able to live with, I continued, is looking back 20 years from now, and realizing I let people take from me over and over again, because I was afraid of being alone. I won't be able to live with becoming like Mom, so busy keeping everyone else happy that I forgot to respect myself. You can call that selfish if you want, you can call it hard, or inflexible, or whatever makes you feel better about what happened tonight, but I call it survival. I call it finally understanding that family is supposed to add to your life, not subtract from it. The party had definitely ended now, though nobody seemed quite sure how to leave, or what the protocol was for departing a birthday celebration that had turned into a property rights dispute. People started gathering their things slowly, awkwardly, avoiding eye contact, and speaking in low murmurs to each other. I caught fragments of conversations, people processing what they'd witnessed, trying to figure out whose side they were on, or if they needed to pick sides at all. Brandon hadn't moved from his chair, still holding that useless folder of fake documents, like he couldn't quite figure out what to do with them. Amber was texting furiously on her phone, probably updating friends or family who hadn't been here about the disaster the evening had become. Uncle Greg and Aunt Victoria stood together near the door, having a heated whispered conversation that stopped abruptly whenever anyone got too close. The whole scene had the surreal quality of a play that had gone off script, actors improvising in real time, with no idea how it was supposed to end. Kyle finally caught my arm, pulling me slightly away from the main group. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, and I mean really okay, not just putting on a strong front because you have to. Because that was intense, Lauren, that was maybe the most intense thing I've ever seen happen in this family. I nodded, appreciating his concern, even as I recognized that I was more okay than I'd been in years. Paradoxically, this needed to happen, I told him. I've been letting things slide for too long, accepting behavior I should have challenged, making excuses for people who didn't respect me. Tonight it all came to a head, and honestly, I'm relieved. It's exhausting to pretend everything's fine when it's not. He glanced back at the dispersing crowd, at Brandon still sitting motionless, and grandmother Diane, looking older and more fragile than I'd seen her. "But what happens now?" he asked. "Like tomorrow and next week, and at Thanksgiving, what happens?" Because you're right, that this needed to happen, but the fallout is going to be complicated. People are going to choose sides. There are going to be awkward holidays and family events where half the people aren't speaking to the other half. Are you prepared for that? I thought about his question seriously, because he wasn't wrong. The immediate confrontation was over, but the consequences would ripple out for months or years, affecting every family gathering and relationship going forward. Some people would understand and support what I'd done, others would see me as the person who destroyed family unity over a house. And there would be plenty in the middle, who just wished everyone would stop fighting and go back to pretending everything was fine. "I'm as prepared as I can be," I finally answered, "and honestly, Kyle, if the price of keeping family peace is letting them steal from me, then that's not peace worth having, that's just me accepting abuse and calling it love. I'd rather have honest conflict than false harmony. At least this way everyone knows where they stand. At least this way I'm not pretending anymore." He nodded slowly, still processing, still trying to reconcile the sister he'd known with this version, who just systematically dismantled family assumptions in front of 20 witnesses. "I get it," he said. "I mean, I'm still catching up to everything you laid out tonight, but I get it, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry I just went along with everyone treating this place like it was communal property when you were the only one maintaining it and paying for it. That was wrong of me too." The apology caught me off guard, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. Kyle had always been neutral, careful not to take sides in family conflicts, and part of me had expected him to stay neutral now, to try to smooth things over, and find compromises that would make everyone comfortable again. The fact that he was acknowledging his own role in the situation, even peripherally, meant more than I'd expected it to. Thanks, I said simply, because anything more would have risked the composure I'd maintained throughout this entire confrontation. That means a lot, Kyle. More than you probably realize. He squeezed my shoulder once, then moved away to help some of the older family members carry things to their cars, playing his usual peacekeeper role even in the aftermath of a situation he couldn't actually fix. I was left standing alone on the deck, watching people filter out through the house and down the driveway where cars were parked. The lake had gone fully dark now, just a black expanse under stars that were starting to emerge as the last light faded from the sky. The familiar sounds of Cedar Point Lake at night surrounded me, bullfrogs and crickets and the gentle lap of water against the dock. This place that had been violated by assumptions and entitlement felt slightly more like mine again, like maybe I could reclaim the peace that had been stolen along with the boundaries. Brandon finally stood up, moving stiffly like his joints had locked during the long period of sitting motionless. He walked over to where I stood, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, filled with things we'd probably never say, understandings we'd never reach. "I'm sorry," he finally said, and unlike Uncle Greg's empty words earlier, this one sounded like it might actually be genuine. "I'm sorry I didn't ask. I'm sorry I assumed. I'm sorry I let them convince me this was okay without questioning it more." It wasn't everything I wanted to hear. It didn't include acknowledgement of the years of boundary violations or the recordings of him claiming to basically own the place. But it was something, and given the circumstances, maybe it was as much as I could expect. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "And I'm sorry your birthday ended like this. That part I mean genuinely. Whatever else happened tonight, you didn't deserve to have your celebration ruined." He laughed, a short bitter sound without much humor. "Well, I definitely won't forget turning 40, he said. "That's for sure." He looked down at the folder still in his hands, the fake deed documents that had been so carefully prepared and were now completely worthless. "What do I do with these?" he asked, and there was something almost childlike in the question, like he genuinely didn't know the proper protocol for disposing of fraudulent property transfer papers. "Shred them," I suggested, "or burn them in that fire pit you've used without permission about 30 times. Just make sure they don't exist anymore, and we'll call it settled." He nodded, then hesitated like there was more he wanted to say. "For what it's worth," he finally continued, "I really did think this was somehow jointly owned, not legally maybe, but in spirit. I thought we had an understanding that this was still family property even if your name was on the paperwork. I wasn't trying to steal from you, I was just accepting what I thought was already partially mine." The explanation didn't excuse anything, but it did provide some context. He'd convinced himself of a reality that didn't exist, built a justification structure that made his behavior seem reasonable from inside his own head. "It's not jointly owned," I said firmly. "It never was, not in spirit or legally or any other way. But I understand that you believed something different, and maybe I should have been more explicit about boundaries earlier, instead of assuming people would respect them without me having to constantly reinforce them. That's on me. But the attempted deed transfer, the party, the whole dramatic presentation, that's on you and your parents. That crossed a line that shouldn't have needed to be drawn." Brandon nodded again, his shoulders sagging with the weight of everything that had been said and couldn't be unsaid. He turned to leave, then paused one more time. "Are we okay?" he asked. And I could hear genuine uncertainty in his voice, like moving forward, is there a path back from this or did I just lose my cousin along with the lake house? I considered the question honestly, because it deserved an honest answer even if that answer was complicated. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Right now I'm still processing everything that happened and everything that almost happened. I need time to figure out what kind of relationship we can have going forward, if any. What I do know is that things can't go back to how they were, where you just assumed access and I stayed quiet about it. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, it has to be based on actual respect, not just polite tolerance." "Fair enough," he said quietly. "I'll give you space, and if you ever want to talk or work through this or whatever, you know how to reach me. He walked away then, joining Amber, who was waiting by the door with their coats and the birthday gift bags that several people had brought, tokens of celebration for an event that had imploded spectacularly. I watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and melancholy, the complicated emotions that come with setting boundaries that cost you relationships you'd hoped to keep. The deck emptied slowly over the next 20 minutes. Aunt Victoria and Uncle Greg left without saying goodbye to me, though I caught Victoria looking back once with an expression I couldn't quite read. Might have been anger, might have been regret, might have been both existing simultaneously in that way emotions do when situations don't have clean resolutions. Grandmother Diane required assistance getting down the steps, and Kyle helped her while she maintained a dignified silence, her earlier accusations apparently exhausted. She didn't look at me as she left, which somehow hurt more than if she'd glared or made one final cutting remark. The other guests filtered out in small groups, some offering awkward goodbyes, others simply disappearing into the night without acknowledging me at all. I stood on the deck and let them go, not trying to smooth things over or make anyone feel better about what they'd witnessed. They'd come here expecting a party and gotten an education instead, a crash course in what happens when assumptions meet reality and property rights collide with family entitlement. Some of them would understand. Others would gossip about it for weeks, turning me into either a hero or a villain depending on which narrative fit their worldview better. When the last car had pulled away, taillights disappearing down the long gravel driveway that wound through pine trees to the main road, Kyle came back up to the deck. He'd stayed behind to help clean up, and together we worked in comfortable silence, collecting abandoned beer bottles and paper plates, wrapping up the untouched birthday cake, blowing out citronella candles that had kept the mosquitoes at bay during what was supposed to be a celebration. The physical work felt good, gave my hands something to do while my mind processed everything that had happened. "You really had cameras and audio recordings?" Kyle finally asked as we carried garbage bags to the outdoor bins, or was that a bluff to make them think twice about trying anything else? The question was fair, and I appreciated that he'd waited until we were alone to ask it. "I really had them," I confirmed. "Still have them, actually. The camera footage is real, the audio recordings are real, the conversations I mentioned are all documented and backed up." I wasn't bluffing about any of it. He whistled low, shaking his head. "That's pretty badass," he said. Also slightly paranoid, but given what just happened, apparently justified paranoia. "When did you start suspecting they were planning something like this?" I thought about the timeline, trying to pinpoint when vague unease had crystallized into actual suspicion. "It started maybe 18 months ago," I said. "Brandon made a comment at Christmas about how he couldn't wait until this place was his, and when I asked what he meant, he laughed it off like it was a joke. But it stuck with me. Then there were little things, like Victoria asking questions about the deed, and how property transfers work, Greg mentioning estate planning and legacy at random family dinners. None of it seemed coordinated at the time, just odd comments that I filed away. But they added up. We finished cleaning and went back inside the lake house, and I locked the door behind us with a finality that felt significant. Kyle settled onto the couch while I made coffee, neither of us ready to end the night yet, despite how emotionally exhausting it had been. The house felt different now, quieter but also more settled, like a space that had been holding its breath could finally exhale. "So what's your actual plan now?" Kyle asked when I handed him a mug. "Are you going to keep letting family use the place, or is that over? Are you changing the locks and taking back all the spare keys?" I sat in the chair across from him, wrapping my hands around my own coffee mug and letting the warmth seep into my palms. "I'm definitely changing the locks," I said. "That's happening tomorrow, first thing. The spare keys are all getting collected, or the locks they open are getting replaced. As for letting family use the place, I don't know yet, maybe eventually, with very clear rules and expectations that are actually followed, but not soon. I need time to reset, to establish that this is my space, and access is a privilege I grant, not a right anyone else has." Kyle nodded, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. "I think that's smart," he said. For what it's worth, I'd like to still be welcome here sometimes. Not moving in or throwing parties or anything crazy, just maybe a weekend here and there when you're not using it. But I understand if you need to close it off completely for a while. I appreciate the acknowledgement that it's your call to make. That meant something. His explicit recognition that he was asking for a favor rather than assuming entitlement. That's the difference, I told him. You asking instead of assuming, you acknowledging that I get to decide, you treating this like what it actually is, which is my property that I might choose to share. That's what's been missing from everyone else's approach. We talked late into the night, the kind of deep conversation siblings sometimes have when crisis strips away the usual surface-level interactions. Kyle asked questions about the renovations I'd done, genuinely interested now in understanding what I'd invested in the place. I showed him receipts, and before photos stored on my phone, the visual evidence of transformation from my parents' modest cabin into something more refined and valuable. He asked about my job in Milwaukee, my life outside of family obligations, things he probably should have known, but had never thought to ask about before. Around midnight he headed to bed in one of the guest rooms, and I stayed up a while longer, sitting on the deck in darkness and listening to the lake. The temperature had dropped into comfortable territory, that perfect late June coolness that makes Wisconsin summers bearable. Stars reflected on the water's surface, thousands of pinpoints of light doubling themselves in the stillness. This was what I'd bought 8 years ago, not just property but peace, not just a structure but a sanctuary. And I'd almost lost it tonight to people who thought family ties gave them ownership of things I'd built alone. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless in the master bedroom I'd renovated 3 years ago, updating the closet and installing better windows and painting the walls a soft gray that caught morning light perfectly. I woke early to sun streaming through those windows, and the sound of loons calling to each other across the water. Kyle was already up, making breakfast in the kitchen, and we ate together on the deck while the lake warmed up and early morning mist burned off the surface. You doing okay? He asked between bites of scrambled eggs, like really processing everything, or still in shock mode. I'm okay, I said, and meant it. I'm angry and hurt and disappointed, but I'm also relieved. It's like I've been waiting for something to break for years, and now it finally has, and at least I don't have to wonder anymore what would happen if I stood up for myself. Now I know, some people will understand and some won't, and I can live with that. After breakfast, Kyle packed up to head back to Milwaukee, back to his own life and obligations. He hugged me at the door, longer than our usual quick goodbye embrace. Call me if you need anything, he said. Or if the family drama escalates, and you need someone in your corner. I've got your back on this, Lauren. I really do. I thanked him and watched him drive away, then stood in the sudden silence of being truly alone in the house for the first time since the confrontation. The day stretched ahead of me with no plans, no obligations, nothing but time to exist in a space that felt more mine now than it had in years. I started with the locks, driving into Pinewood Harbor to the hardware store where I'd bought renovation supplies over the years. The owner recognized me, asked how the lake house was treating me, and I almost laughed at the loaded question. It's treating me fine, I said. Just need to upgrade security a bit. He didn't ask why, just helped me select new deadbolts and handle sets that would be harder to pick or bypass. Back at the house, I spent the afternoon methodically changing every lock, front door and back door and the side entrance near the garage. I collected the spare keys from their hiding places, the fake rock and the magnetic box under the deck railing, and the one tucked above the door frame. Each key I found felt like reclaiming a small piece of territory, taking back access I'd granted too freely. When I finished, I had one set of keys on my ring, and no spares hidden anywhere. Anyone who wanted in would have to go through me first. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine, rising early and having coffee on the deck, spending hours doing small projects around the property, eating simple meals and reading books I'd been meaning to get to for months. The solitude was restorative in ways I hadn't anticipated. Nobody showed up unannounced. Nobody texted to ask if they could come visit. The phone stayed quiet except for a few messages from Kyle checking in, and one from a cousin on my dad's side who'd heard about the birthday party disaster and wanted to make sure I was okay. On the fourth day, Aunt Victoria called, and I almost didn't answer, seeing her name on the screen and feeling my stomach tighten with anticipation of whatever she was going to say. But I'd never been someone who avoided difficult conversations, so I picked up. "Hello, Victoria," I said, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause on the other end, then her voice, sounding strained and formal. "Lauren, I wanted to reach out because we need to discuss what happened and how we move forward as a family." I walked down to the dock while she talked, my bare feet on sun-warmed wood, watching dragonflies skim the water's surface. "What did you want to discuss specifically?" I asked, because if this is going to be another attempt to make me feel guilty for not going along with the deed transfer, we probably don't have much to talk about. "No," she said quickly. "No, that's not why I'm calling. I've spoken with our attorney, the one who drew up those documents, and he's extremely concerned about the legal implications of what we attempted. He's advised us very strongly not to pursue anything further and to destroy all copies of the paperwork." "That's good advice," I said. "I'm glad someone is being sensible about this." There was another pause, longer this time, and I could hear her breathing on the other end, working up to whatever she actually wanted to say. "I owe you an apology," she finally said, and the words sounded like they cost her something to produce. "A real one, not the half-hearted thing Greg said at the party. What we did was wrong. Not just wrong because it didn't work out, but wrong from the beginning. We convinced ourselves we were doing something good for the family, but really we were just taking advantage of your generosity and assuming you'd let us get away with it." The apology was more than I'd expected, and I felt some of the anger I'd been carrying start to loosen its grip. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her honestly. "That means something, Victoria. It doesn't fix everything immediately, but it's a start." She made a sound that might have been relief, or might have been something else. "Can I ask," she said hesitantly, "where do we go from here? I know things can't just go back to normal, but is there a path forward? Can we eventually rebuild some kind of relationship?" I sat down on the dock, dangling my feet over the edge, toes just above the water. "I think so," I said slowly. "But it's going to take time, and it's going to require actually respecting boundaries going forward. This house is mine. Access to it is something I decide, not something anyone else is entitled to. If you can accept that genuinely, not just say you accept it but actually treat me and my property with respect, then maybe we can work back to something functional." "I can do that," Victoria said. "I will do that. And Lauren, for what it's worth, I really am sorry. Not just about the deed thing, but about all the times over the years I dismissed you, or made you feel like your needs didn't matter as much as keeping everyone else comfortable. You were right about your mother. I watched her disappear into what everyone else wanted, and I never said anything about it. I didn't want to see the same thing happen to you, but I ended up contributing to it instead." We talked for another 20 minutes, not resolving everything but starting the slow process of rebuilding something that might eventually resemble trust. When we hung up, I sat on the dock a while longer, processing the conversation, recognizing that healing would be complicated and non-linear, but maybe not impossible. Some relationships were worth fighting for even after they'd been damaged, others weren't. The trick was figuring out which was which. Brandon called 2 days later, his voice tentative when I answered. "Hey Lauren," he said. "I wasn't sure if you'd pick up. I'm glad you did." We talked for over an hour, him asking questions about the renovations and the costs, and everything I'd put into the place that he'd never bothered to notice or acknowledge before. He apologized again, more thoroughly this time, walking through specific instances of boundary violations and accepting responsibility without making excuses. I asked if Amber was okay with him reaching out, and he said she was coming around, starting to understand that what had seemed like family togetherness was actually something more problematic. By the end of the call, we'd established some ground rules. If he wanted to visit the lake house in the future, he'd ask at least 2 weeks in advance. He'd respect my calendar and accept no as a complete answer. He'd contribute to maintenance costs if he used the place, paying utilities and cleaning fees, rather than treating it as free accommodation. And most importantly, he'd stop referring to it as family property in any context. It was my property, mine alone, and his access was conditional on respecting that reality. The summer rolled on, days blending into each other in the easy way lake house summers do. I worked remotely from the screened porch when I needed to, took afternoons off to swim or kayak, or simply exist in a hammock with a book. Kyle visited once, bringing his girlfriend who I'd only met a handful of times before, and we had an easy weekend with no drama or tension or boundary violations. He asked permission before using anything, contributed groceries without being asked, left the place cleaner than he'd found it. It was such a stark contrast to years of people treating my space like a free hotel that I found myself getting emotional about it, touched by the basic respect I should have been receiving all along. Grandmother Diane reached out in late July, asking if she could visit to talk. I agreed warily, unsure what to expect, but willing to hear her out. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, moving slowly up the deck steps with her cane, looking older than she had at Brandon's party. We sat in rocking chairs overlooking the water, and for a long time neither of us spoke, just rocked and watched boats drift by in the distance. I was wrong, she finally said, her voice quiet but clear. About you, about the situation, about what family means. I spent so much time trying to keep everyone together that I forgot to consider whether we should be together, whether the relationships we were maintaining were healthy or just habitual. You were right to stand up for yourself. Your mother would have been proud of you, even if seeing her that way hurt me to hear. We talked through the afternoon and into evening, her sharing stories about my mother I'd never heard before, admitting to times she'd pressured her daughter into compliance and regretted it later. I shared my own memories, the observations I'd kept quiet about for years, and slowly we started building something that felt more honest than what we'd had before. She didn't ask to stay the night or visit again soon. She just asked if we could talk sometimes, regular phone calls where we actually said true things instead of maintaining pleasant fictions. I agreed. August brought news that Uncle Greg and Aunt Victoria were separating, their marriage apparently unable to survive the stress of the failed property transfer and everything it had revealed about how they made decisions and treated family. Kyle filled me in over the phone, his tone concerned, but not entirely surprised. Apparently they'd been having problems for a while, and the lake house incident was just the final straw. I felt bad for them despite everything, divorce being its own kind of grief, regardless of circumstances. September arrived with cooler temperatures, and the first hints of fall color in the trees around Cedar Point Lake. I started closing up the house for the season, winterizing pipes, and putting away patio furniture, and making sure everything was secure for the months I wouldn't be here as often. Standing on the dock one last time before heading back to Milwaukee for good until next summer, I thought about how much had changed since Brandon's birthday party, and how much had stayed exactly the same. The lake still reflected the sky perfectly. The loons still called to each other at dawn and dusk. The sunset still painted everything gold and purple before fading to darkness. What had changed was my relationship to this place, and my understanding of what it meant to truly own something. Not just legally on paper, but in the deeper sense of having claimed it fully, defended it when necessary, and established boundary that protected both the property and myself. I thought about the woman who'd stood at that birthday party holding a gift bag, and watching her family try to steal from her. She'd been angry and hurt, but also somehow still hoping it was all a misunderstanding, still wanting to believe the best about people who'd proven they didn't deserve that faith. The woman standing on the dock now was different. Harder maybe, but also more whole, someone who'd learned that self-respect sometimes costs you relationships, but preserves something more essential than comfort or convenience. The drive back to Milwaukee felt different too, less like leaving something behind and more like carrying it with me. The lake house would be here when I needed it, locked and secure and entirely mine. Family relationships would continue to evolve, some healing and others fading away naturally as people chose how much effort they wanted to invest in rebuilding trust. And I would keep moving forward, carrying the lessons of that confrontation with me, remembering what happened when I finally stopped being quiet and started being heard. Life went on in the complicated way life does after major disruptions. Holidays were awkward at first, with some family members not attending events where I'd be present, and others going out of their way to include me and show support. Brandon and I eventually reached a place of careful friendship, not close like we'd been as kids, but functional and respectful. He never asked to use the lake house again, which I appreciated, understanding that some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt the same way. Victoria and I developed an unexpected closeness after her divorce, her newfound independence seeming to make her more empathetic to my earlier stance. We met for coffee occasionally, when I was in Milwaukee, talking about everything from property management to family dynamics, to what it meant to rebuild your life after it fell apart. She asked good questions now, listened without trying to fix or dismiss, and slowly I started to trust her again in small measured ways. The lake house remained my sanctuary, my refuge, my proof that standing up for yourself doesn't destroy you even when it feels like it might. I made new memories there, some alone and some with carefully chosen company, people who respected boundaries and understood that love doesn't mean unlimited access. The deed stayed in my name alone, the locks stayed changed, and every time I drove up that gravel driveway through the pine trees, I felt the same sense of coming home to something I'd fought for and won. Years later, when people asked about the lake house and how I'd come to own it, I'd tell them the simple version, the one about inheritance and renovation, and choosing to invest in a place that mattered. But sometimes with people I trusted, I'd tell the fuller story, the one about a birthday party that turned into a reckoning, and a family that tried to take something that wasn't theirs. I'd tell them about standing on a deck, surrounded by people who thought I'd stay quiet and choosing instead to speak. I'd tell them about locks and deeds and security cameras, about the practical tools of protection when boundaries alone aren't enough. And I'd tell them the ending, the part about how sometimes the cost of being heard is being misunderstood, and the price of self-respect is other people's comfort, and that's okay, that's more than okay. Because at the end of every story about standing up for yourself, there's a person who's still standing, still whole, still certain they made the right choice even when it was the hard one. That person gets to keep their property and their dignity and their self-respect. And that person gets to look at themselves in the mirror and recognize who's looking back, undiminished by compromise that crossed into erasure. The lake house stands on Cedar Point Lake still, through summers and winters, through storms and calm, through seasons of use and seasons of rest. It belongs to me the way things do when you fought for them, paid for them, defended them against people who thought want was the same as deserve. And every time I turn that key in those locks I changed, every time I walk through that door into space that's entirely mine, I'm reminded that the strongest foundations aren't just the ones we build under structures. They're the ones we build inside ourselves, the unshakable certainty that we're worth defending even when the people we love suggest otherwise. That's what I learned from a birthday party that wasn't really about birthdays, and a deed that was never really in question, and a family that had to fracture before it could begin to heal. I learned that silence isn't always golden, that peace isn't always worth its cost, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to let them treat you badly. The lake remembers all of it, holding those memories in its depths, along with everything else that's happened on its shores. And I remember too, every time I visit, every time I sit on that deck, and watch the sunset paint the water gold, every time I choose myself again and again, and know I made the right choice. The first winter after everything changed, brought an unexpected clarity to my life in Milwaukee. My apartment, which had always felt like a temporary landing place, between weekends at the lake, started to feel more permanent, more intentional. I rearranged furniture, hung artwork I'd been storing in closets, invested in the kind of kitchen equipment that suggested someone who planned to stay a while. The city had its own rhythm, different from the quiet constancy of Cedar Point Lake, and I found myself appreciating both for what they offered, rather than treating one as an escape from the other. Work became more engaging too, maybe because I was bringing a different energy to it, the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle difficult confrontations and survive them intact. My colleagues noticed the shift, commented that I seemed more assertive in meetings, more willing to push back on ideas that didn't serve the project well. My boss pulled me aside one afternoon in late November to say she was impressed with my recent contributions and wanted to discuss opportunities for advancement. The conversation led to a promotion by January, more responsibility and better pay, and the kind of professional validation that felt earned rather than accidental. The holidays presented their own challenges, as Kyle had predicted they would. Thanksgiving was split into two separate gatherings, one that I attended with Kyle and a few cousins who'd reached out after the birthday party incident, and another that apparently included Brandon, Victoria, and the relatives who'd decided I was the villain in this story. I felt the absence of unified family traditions, the loss of something that had existed my whole life even if it had been built on unstable foundations. But I also felt relief at not having to navigate hostile dynamics or pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Christmas brought a surprise when a package arrived at my apartment, postmarked from Pinewood Harbor with no return address. Inside was a wooden ornament, hand-carved in the shape of a small lake house, detailed enough that I could make out tiny windows and a miniature dock. A note tucked underneath read simply, "For the architect who knew her own worth, Merry Christmas." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but something about the craftsmanship reminded me of the woodworker in town who'd helped me build custom shelving for the lake house 3 summers ago. I hung it on my small apartment tree and felt an unexpected warmth, evidence that support existed in places I hadn't been looking for it. The new year arrived with its usual promises of fresh starts and new chapters, and I found myself actually believing in the possibility this time. January brought deep cold to Wisconsin, the kind that made the lake house impractical to visit even if I'd wanted to, pipes at risk of freezing despite the winterization, roads often impassable after storms. But I thought about it frequently, visualizing the way snow would blanket the deck, and frost would pattern the windows, the lake frozen solid enough to walk on if you were brave enough to try. February brought an unexpected call from a real estate developer who'd heard about the property through channels I couldn't quite trace. He made an offer, substantial enough to make me pause, numbers that would eliminate any financial stress for years to come. The lake house has appreciated significantly, he explained, location and recent improvements making it valuable to the right buyer. He spoke about market trends and investment potential, and the kind of returns I could expect if I was willing to sell. I listened politely, thanked him for his interest, and declined without hesitation. Some things weren't for sale regardless of price, and I'd fought too hard for this particular thing to let it go for any amount of money. Spring came slowly to Wisconsin that year, winter holding on stubbornly through March and into early April. But when it finally released its grip, the transformation was dramatic. The drive up to Cedar Point Lake on the first warm weekend revealed a landscape coming back to life, trees budding and grass greening and the lake itself shedding its ice layer piece by piece. The house had survived the winter perfectly, my careful preparation having protected it from the worst of the cold. I spent that first weekend opening it back up, checking systems and airing out rooms and restoring it to the living space it became during warmer months. Standing on the deck that first evening back, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of pink and orange, I felt the full weight of what I'd preserved. Not just a structure or a piece of property, but a sanctuary, a place where I could exist without performance or pretense, where the only expectations were the ones I set for myself. The confrontation at Brandon's birthday party had been necessary and painful, and ultimately worth it because it had secured this exact moment of peace, on a deck I'd built with my own decisions and defended with my own voice. Kyle visited in May with news that he'd been promoted at his job and was considering buying a place of his own, maybe something with a little land outside the city, where he could escape when Milwaukee felt too crowded. We talked about property ownership over dinner on the deck, him asking questions about the process and the responsibilities and what it felt like to have something entirely your own. I shared what I'd learned, both the practical aspects of maintenance and taxes, and the less tangible understanding of what it meant to fight for something and win. He listened carefully, taking mental notes, and I recognized something of myself in his questions, that same desire to build something solid and defensible. Summer arrived with its familiar patterns, weekends at the lake and weekdays in Milwaukee, a rhythm that felt sustainable in ways it hadn't before the confrontation. I was more selective about who I invited to the lake house now, more intentional about protecting the peace I'd fought for. A few carefully chosen friends made the trip, people who appreciated the space without trying to claim it, who respected boundaries without needing them constantly reinforced. The house held their presence easily, rooms that had been violated by assumption now hosting genuine guests who understood the difference between welcome and entitlement. Brandon reached out in June, asking if we could meet somewhere neutral to talk, not at the lake house or a family gathering but somewhere that belonged to neither of us. We met at a coffee shop halfway between Milwaukee and his home in the suburbs, sitting at an outside table in pleasant weather that made difficult conversations slightly easier. He looked different, older maybe or just more worn, the confidence he'd always carried tempered by something that might have been humility. We talked for 2 hours, covering ground we'd touched on in phone calls, but going deeper now with the benefit of face-to-face conversation. He told me about marriage counseling he and Amber had started, working through how the birthday party incident had revealed deeper issues in their relationship, patterns of entitlement and assumption that extended beyond just the lake house situation. He talked about his relationship with his parents, how Uncle Greg's example had shaped his understanding of what men were supposed to take and claim, rather than ask for and appreciate. And he apologized again, more thoroughly than he had before, walking through specific memories of boundary violations and accepting full responsibility for behavior he could now see clearly. I shared my own perspective, explaining how years of small violations had accumulated into something larger, how silence in the face of disrespect had cost me pieces of myself I'd had to fight to reclaim. I told him about the loneliness of being the only one who saw the problems, the isolation of standing up for yourself when everyone else wants you to sit back down. And I told him that while I appreciated his apology and his evident growth, rebuilding trust would take time, possibly years, possibly forever if certain boundaries got crossed again. We parted with an agreement to keep talking, to continue the slow work of building something new from the wreckage of what we'd been before. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, more like acknowledgement that people can change and relationships can evolve, and nothing has to stay broken just because it broke. The drive back to Milwaukee felt lighter somehow, like I'd set down a weight I'd been carrying without fully realizing its burden. July brought grandmother Diane to Milwaukee for a doctor's appointment, and she asked if she could stay with me rather than getting a hotel. I agreed with some hesitation, unsure how it would feel to share space with her after everything that had happened. But the visit went surprisingly well, her moving carefully through my apartment and respecting my routines in ways she hadn't always done before. We cooked dinner together one evening, working side by side in my small kitchen, and she talked about her own mother, my great-grandmother who I'd barely known. She was fierce, grandmother Diane said, chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency, fiercer than I ever let myself be. She had opinions and she shared them, and she didn't apologize for taking up space in the world. I always thought I should be softer than that, more accommodating, more focused on keeping everyone happy. But watching you stand up for yourself at that birthday party, I realized maybe fierce was the better inheritance. Maybe your great-grandmother had it right all along. The conversation opened something between us, creating space for honesty that had been missing from our relationship. She admitted to favoring Brandon because he reminded her of her own father, charismatic and confident in ways that made him easy to celebrate. She admitted to being harder on me because I reminded her of herself, and she'd spent so much of her life being disappointed in her own choices that she'd projected that disappointment onto me. And she admitted that watching me refuse to back down had forced her to confront questions about her own life, roads not taken, and voices not raised and boundaries never established. We talked late into the night, her sharing regrets I'd never expected to hear, and me offering understanding I hadn't known I was capable of giving. By the time she left to return home, something had shifted between us, not back to what it was before but forward into something new, more honest and therefore more solid. She hugged me at the door, longer than usual, and whispered thank you in a way that carried weight beyond the simple words. August brought the first anniversary of Brandon's birthday party, and I noted the date with a mixture of emotions. A full year since that confrontation, since everything had cracked open and forced itself into new configurations. I drove up to the lake house that weekend alone, wanting to mark the occasion and the place where it had all happened. The deck looked exactly the same, fairy lights still strung along the railing, though I rarely turned them on anymore. The table where the birthday cake had sat was still there, weathered slightly by a year of sun and rain but fundamentally unchanged. I sat in the spot where I'd stood when Uncle Greg had announced the deed transfer, looking out at the view that was entirely mine, legally and morally and in every way that mattered. The anger that had burned so hot that night had cooled to something else, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance, recognition that people do terrible things sometimes, and you get to choose whether that destroys you or teaches you something essential about your own strength. I chose the lesson, chose to let that night be the beginning of something rather than the end, and sitting there on the anniversary, I felt grateful for the pain that had led to clarity. Fall arrived with its usual spectacular display, trees around Cedar Point Lake transforming into brilliant reds and golds and oranges. I took a week of vacation in October, spending it entirely at the lake house, working remotely when necessary and otherwise just existing in the space I'd fought for. The solitude was healing in ways I was still discovering, hours passing in gentle productivity or complete stillness, no one to perform for or accommodate or negotiate with. Just me and the lake, and the changing seasons and the solid certainty of ownership earned through conflict and maintained through vigilance. Kyle visited during that week, bringing his girlfriend Melissa, who I'd gotten to know better over the summer months. They were talking about moving in together, navigating the conversations about space and boundaries and expectations that any cohabitation required. I found myself offering advice from hard-won experience, talking about the importance of clear communication and the danger of assuming understanding without explicit agreement. Melissa thanked me later, privately, saying Kyle had told her about what happened at Brandon's party, and she thought it took courage to stand up to family like that. It wasn't courage, I told her, it was necessity. There's a difference between being brave and simply refusing to let yourself be destroyed. I did what I had to do to survive intact, to keep something that was mine, to establish that I was worth defending. That's not courage, that's just clarity about your own value. She'd looked at me thoughtfully and said maybe those were the same thing, maybe recognizing your own worth in the face of people who wanted to diminish it was exactly what courage looked like. I'd smiled and changed the subject, uncomfortable with being cast as heroic when I'd just been trying to protect myself. November brought Thanksgiving again, the second one since the birthday party incident, and this year felt different. More family members reached out about attending the gathering Kyle and I were hosting, people who'd sat out the previous year apparently ready to navigate whatever awkwardness remained. We rented a space in Milwaukee, neutral territory that belonged to none of us, and nearly 20 people showed up, including several I hadn't expected to see. Brandon came with Amber and their new baby, a daughter they'd named Caroline. He'd asked permission weeks in advance, making it clear he'd understand if I wasn't ready for that, if having them there would make the day uncomfortable for me. But I'd agreed, curious to see if we could exist in the same space without the tension that had defined every interaction since his birthday. It went better than expected, conversation flowing around and sometimes through the history we carried, people making efforts to be kind if not necessarily close. Uncle Greg showed up alone, Victoria having declined the invitation for reasons no one quite explained. He looked diminished somehow, the authority he'd always carried reduced by divorce, and the recognition that his choices had consequences beyond what he'd anticipated. He approached me hesitantly before dinner, asking if we could speak privately. We stepped outside into the cold November afternoon, breath visible in the air between us. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this past year," he said without preamble. "A lot of therapy, actually trying to understand why I thought that deed transfer was acceptable, what made me believe I had any right to your property. And I've come to realize it was never really about the lake house. It was about control, about maintaining a version of family where I got to make decisions and everyone else went along with them. Your mother used to go along with it. Your father mostly did too, and I got used to that, expected it, felt entitled to it." He paused, looking out at the street where cars passed by carrying people to their own Thanksgiving gatherings. "When you refused to go along with it, when you stood up and said no in front of everyone, it broke something in me. Not in a bad way necessarily, but it shattered this illusion I'd been living in, where my way was the right way, and anyone who disagreed was just being difficult. So I want to thank you actually, for showing me that particular mirror, even though I hated looking into it at the time." The apology was more complete than anything Victoria had offered, more self-aware than Brandon's various attempts. I accepted it with the understanding that acceptance didn't mean everything was suddenly fine, just that I was willing to acknowledge his growth and see where it led. We went back inside to join the others, and dinner proceeded with the kind of careful politeness that marked families in transition, not yet healed, but no longer actively wounded. December brought the kind of cold that made even thinking about the lake house seem like a distant summer dream. I stayed in Milwaukee, working on year-end projects and spending quiet evenings in my apartment that no longer felt temporary. On Christmas Eve I received a card from grandmother Diane, her handwriting shaky but readable, telling me she was proud of who I'd become, and sorry for the years she'd tried to make me smaller. Inside was a check, substantial enough to make me pause, with a note that said for the lake house, for whatever improvements or repairs, or simple enjoyment you choose. It's yours to spend as you see fit, because I finally understand that it's yours, period. I deposited the check and used it exactly as she'd suggested, hiring contractors to build a better boat dock and upgrade the screened porch and install a new heating system that would make the house usable even during shoulder seasons. The work was scheduled for early spring, preparation for another summer of weekends by the water, another season of maintaining what I'd fought to keep. Each improvement felt like a small victory, evidence that the property wasn't just mine legally, but mine to shape and develop according to my own vision. The second anniversary of Brandon's birthday party passed with less fanfare than the first, just a quiet acknowledgement as I looked at the calendar and noted the date. 2 years since everything changed, since I'd been forced to choose between keeping peace and keeping my self-respect. The choice had cost me relationships and comfort, and the easy fiction that family always meant safety. But it had given me something more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that I could survive conflict, could stand up for myself even when everyone wanted me to sit down, could defend what was mine without apologizing for the defense. Spring brought the contractors to Cedar Point Lake, and I took time off work to be there while they worked, wanting to oversee the improvements personally. The new dock was beautiful, cedar planks that would age to silver gray over time, sturdy enough to last decades. The screened porch got upgraded with better screens, and ceiling fans and electrical outlets for the laptop I used when working remotely. and the heating system transformed the house from a summer retreat to a year-round possibility, opening up seasons I'd previously surrendered to the cold. Kyle visited in April to see the improvements, bringing Melissa and announcing that they'd bought a small house together outside the city, closing scheduled for May. We celebrated on the newly rebuilt dock, drinking wine and watching the sunset, talking about the strange parallel journeys we'd been on, both learning what it meant to own something and protect it and make it truly ours. He thanked me for the example I'd set, for showing him that standing up for yourself didn't mean being cruel or vindictive, just being clear about boundaries and willing to enforce them. Summer arrived again, the third since the confrontation, and life settled into patterns that felt sustainable. Work was going well, my promotion having led to more opportunities, and the kind of professional respect that came from consistently good performance. Friends in Milwaukee had become more important, my social circle widening to include people who knew nothing about the lake house drama, and therefore interacted with me without that history coloring their perception. And the lake house remained my sanctuary, weekends spent there feeding something essential in me, providing the solitude and peace necessary to balance the demands of city life. Brandon and I had settled into a cordial distance, occasional texts and family gatherings where we were friendly without being close. He'd stopped asking to visit the lake house, apparently understanding that some boundaries, once established, were permanent. Amber sent a card on the anniversary of the birthday party, 3 years after the incident, acknowledging the date and thanking me for handling everything with more grace than the situation deserved. I appreciated the gesture even as I recognized that grace hadn't been my priority, survival had, and anything that looked like grace was just the byproduct of refusing to be destroyed. Grandmother Diane's health declined that fall, age and various ailments catching up with her in ways that made her mortality suddenly visible. I visited her often in the nursing facility, where she'd moved, sitting with her in comfortable silence, or engaging in the rambling conversations that old age seemed to encourage. She talked about regrets sometimes, roads not taken, and voices not raised, and all the times she'd chosen peace over justice, and wondered if it had been worth it. I never told her what to think about her own choices, just listened and held her hand, and reminded her that she'd taught me things even in her mistakes, shown me what happened when you spent too much time making other people comfortable at your own expense. She passed in November, quietly in her sleep, and the family gathered for the funeral with the complicated emotions that death always brings. We were all there, the ones who'd sided with me and the ones who hadn't, the ones who'd apologized and the ones who still thought I'd overreacted, united temporarily by grief if nothing else. I spoke at the service, talking about the grandmother I'd known, and the one I'd come to understand better in her final years, the woman who'd made mistakes and owned them and tried to do better, even when better came too late to fix everything. The will reading brought a final surprise, Grandmother Diane having left me a letter to be opened privately. I read it later at the lake house, sitting on the dock in unseasonable warmth for late November. She wrote about watching me stand up for myself at Brandon's birthday party, how terrifying and thrilling it had been to see someone refuse to back down. She wrote about her own life, the times she should have stood up and didn't, the cost of that silence on her sense of self. And she wrote about pride, how proud she was that I'd learned lessons she'd failed to learn herself, that I'd valued myself enough to fight for what was mine, even when fighting meant losing things. She'd taught me to prioritize above everything else. Keep being fierce, she'd written in closing. Keep defending what's yours, and understanding your own worth, and refusing to be diminished by people who should know better. You've built something real, not just that lake house, but a life that belongs entirely to you, and that's the best inheritance anyone could hope for. I folded the letter carefully and added it to the folder of important documents I kept at the lake house, evidence and encouragement existing side by side, proof of where I'd been, and affirmation of where I was going. Winter came again, the cycle continuing, and I found myself thinking about time and change, and the ways both had reshaped my understanding of family and property and self-worth. 4 years since Brandon's birthday party, 4 years of learning and growing and defending what I'd built. The lake house stood solid through another Wisconsin winter, protected by systems I'd installed and maintained, owned completely by someone who understood that ownership meant responsibility and vigilance and the willingness to say no when no was necessary. The relationship with my family had evolved into something I could live with, if not entirely celebrate. Some connections had strengthened, others had faded, and a few had disappeared entirely. That was the cost and the gift of standing up for yourself, understanding that not everyone would appreciate the stand, that some people preferred the version of you that bent rather than the version that held firm. But I'd gained something more valuable than universal approval, the specific approval that mattered most, my own. Spring brought contractors again, this time for smaller projects, maintenance and updates that kept the property in good condition. I'd learned to invest in the lake house, the way you invest in anything you plan to keep, regular attention and care that prevented small problems from becoming large ones. The place had appreciated in value over the years, the developer's earlier offer looking modest compared to current market assessments. But value wasn't measured only at potential sale price, and the lake house's worth to me had nothing to do with what someone else might pay for it. Years continued to pass in the way years do, marked by seasons and holidays, and the small accumulations of living. Work evolved, relationships shifted, the lake house remained constant. I'd become someone different from the woman who'd stood at Brandon's birthday party, holding a gift bag and watching her family try to steal from her. Not harder exactly, though boundaries had become easier to maintain with practice. Not colder, though I was more selective about where I directed warmth, just clearer, more certain of my own worth, and more willing to defend it without apology or explanation. The lake house held all of it, every season and struggle and small victory. The deck where the confrontation had happened, the locks I'd changed multiple times, the improvements I'd made year after year, all of it evidence of a choice to fight for something and the discipline to maintain what I'd won. People sometimes asked if I ever regretted how things had gone, if I wished I'd handled the situation differently, found some way to preserve both the property and the relationships it had cost. And I'd think about the question seriously before answering, because it deserved serious consideration. But the answer was always no, I didn't regret it, wouldn't change it if I could. Because that night at Brandon's birthday party had taught me something essential about myself, revealed a strength I hadn't known I possessed, and a clarity I hadn't known I could access. It had shown me that silence wasn't the same as peace, that preserving relationships at any cost was actually the most expensive choice of all, and that sometimes the only way forward was through conflict that felt like it might destroy everything but actually just destroyed the things that needed to fall apart. The lake house stood on Cedar Point Lake, owned completely and defended successfully by someone who'd learned that the most important thing you can build isn't structures or relationships or even legacy. It's the unshakable certainty that you're worth defending, that your boundaries matter, that your property and your peace and your sense of self are valuable enough to fight for even when fighting costs you things you thought you couldn't live without. And standing on that dock, in the golden light of another sunset, keys to changed locks in my pocket and deed in my name alone, I knew I'd made the right choice every single time I'd chosen myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.